I was halfway through wiping down a counter at the bookstore when I noticed her. The way she lingered at the fiction section, tilting her head like she was trying to read the spine of a book from memory rather than the title. She had that quiet confidence that made the fluorescent lights feel softer somehow, like the air bent around her. And then she stepped away, probably to make a call or meet someone, and I caught myself holding my breath, watching the line of her shoulders disappear. Her cousin was behind her, fiddling with the sleeve of her coat, muttering something I couldn't catch. But the words that reached me, clear as a bell in the quiet, were, "Don't go yet." The way she whispered it was half laugh, half serious, but the pause that followed hung longer than it should have, longer than normal conversation warrants. I didn't know why, but I felt it sink into me, something electric and small, the kind that makes your stomach twitch and your palms itch. I tried to focus on the register, pretending I had more pressing work, but the sound of her shoes sliding across the polished floor kept pulling me back. She returned a moment later, carrying a worn-out novel in her hand. She didn't smile at first. There was just the brush of her hair behind her ear, a flick of her wrist adjusting the bag strap, and that brief glance that felt too intimate to be casual. I managed a nod, maybe a little too stiff. "Found what you were looking for?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out softer than intended. She glanced at me, and I swear I caught a fraction of a smirk, the kind that didn't quite touch the corners of her eyes. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I'm just pretending." Her voice was layered, like she was saying more than the words aloud. There was a pause, and I found myself suddenly aware of the quiet between us, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the low scrape of a cart somewhere down the aisle. I felt the impulse to reach out, to offer something, an extra bookmark, a suggestion, a word that would make the silence less heavy, but I didn't. Instead, I shuffled my hands, feeling them too big and clumsy, and watched her tuck the book under her arm with that effortless, unbothered motion. Then she did something small but impossible to ignore. Her fingers brushed the edge of the counter as she leaned slightly closer to set down her bag. It was a movement that could have been nothing, just the angle, the momentum, but it left a trace, a subtle charge in the air that made my chest tighten for no reason I could name. She glanced at the window, then back at me, and for a second, the world narrowed. There was a weight behind her gaze, quiet but insistently there, like she was measuring me in ways I wasn't ready to understand. I felt a flush creep up my neck, and I swallowed the words I wanted to say, because none of them would matter anyway. By the time she walked away again, there was nothing obvious to mark the moment. No gesture, no goodbye, but I couldn't stop feeling the aftershock. The faint scrape of her shoes, the whisper of her cousin's voice in the distance, even the way the bookstore smelled like paper and polish. It all kept circling in my mind. I stayed behind the counter longer than I needed to, pretending to straighten a stack of novels. But really I was replaying that pause, that glance, that brush of fingers. Something had sparked, I realized. Something small, fragile, and completely unspoken. And I already knew I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about it. The next time I saw her, it was in the corner of the repair shop where I worked part-time. She had brought in a tablet that wasn't charging. Her expression was neutral, polite, but there was something in the way she held herself, like she was bracing for a conversation she didn't want to have. "Thanks for fitting me in," she said, her voice calm, but the slight tremor at the edge made me pause. I gestured to the workbench. "No problem. Shouldn't take long." I tried to keep my tone light, but I noticed the way her shoulders tensed as she leaned against the counter. I started disassembling the tablet, my hands moving automatically, though I couldn't help stealing glances at her. She had that quiet, controlled energy, every movement deliberate, but tiny slips gave her away. A sigh too soft, a glance downward that lingered too long. "You do this a lot?" she asked, voice casual. "Yeah, enough to be dangerous," I said, shrugging. But she didn't laugh at the joke. She just tilted her head slightly, watching my hands. And then she laughed, softly, but not fully. It was a laugh that started in her chest, hesitated, and almost disappeared before it reached her lips. I realized I was staring, mesmerized by the way the corners of her mouth curved. "Your hands are precise," she said, almost an afterthought. eyes following my fingers as they worked. There was a pause, a hesitation that I felt more than I heard, and I knew she was struggling with some thought she didn't want to voice. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch. I watched the way her nails caught the light as she brushed a strand of hair back, the subtle tension in her wrists. She was beautiful in a way that wasn't obvious, more in the little details than in the surface polish. And the more I observed, the more aware I became that she was deliberately distant, but not entirely closed off. I didn't expect it to be complicated, she admitted finally, almost whispering. Her fingers traced the edge of the counter, brushing over the chipped paint, and I felt the weight of the pause that followed. She looked tired, her eyes a shade duller than the week before, but the tension in her shoulders suggested she was holding herself together anyway. I met her gaze for a fraction of a second, just enough to notice the flicker of something unspoken, perhaps hesitation, or worry, or the faintest thread of trust. My pulse picked up, though I didn't move. When the tablet finally powered on, she picked it up, her fingers brushing mine briefly. It was accidental, but deliberate enough to linger in the senses, a spark that made the quiet hum of the repair shop feel louder than it was. She smiled, the edges softening just a little. Thanks for being careful. There was something in the tone, subtle, layered, and entirely unspoken, that pulled at me. She left before I could say anything else, but the echo of her presence stayed behind. Her hands, her laugh, the fatigue in her eyes, they were impossible to shake. And even as the shop returned to its usual hum, I realized I'd been holding my breath the entire time, waiting for a moment that hadn't even fully existed. It was late, and the repair shop was almost empty, the overhead lights buzzing softly above the scattered tools and workbenches. Rain rattled against the windows in uneven bursts, and the smell of wet asphalt mixed with the faint scent of solder and oil. She was there, leaning over a small circuit board, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I can't get this connector to line up right," she muttered, fingers hovering over the delicate pins. I stepped closer, just enough to see the angle better. My shoulder brushed hers, a fleeting contact that made both of us pause. I didn't pull back. I didn't need to. There was a weight to that closeness, a tension that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. "Here, if you tilt it slightly." I guided her hands carefully, my voice low. Her fingers were warm against mine, just long enough to make my pulse catch. I wanted to linger, to let something happen, but the sound of her phone buzzing on the counter broke the moment. She glanced at the screen, hesitated, then swiped it away without answering. I noticed the small hitch in her breath, the faint crease between her brows, and I realized it was her ex, probably a call she didn't want to take. The interruption yanked us back to the real world, reminding me that this, whatever it was complicated. We worked in silence after that, our hands occasionally brushing again as we adjusted tiny screws and connectors. Every touch was electric, but I forced myself to focus on the work, on the humming of the tools, on the storm outside. My mind raced with thoughts I didn't allow to speak aloud. I wanted to ask her to stay longer, to admit the pull I felt, but even breathing those words seemed reckless. "I didn't expect it to be this tricky," she said finally, voice quieter than usual, almost confessional. She leaned closer, inspecting the board from above my shoulder. Her hair brushed my cheek, and for a heartbeat, I forgot to think at all. The warmth of her proximity was confusing, grounding, and disorienting at once. The lights flickered, an old fuse, nothing dangerous, and we both flinched, our hands momentarily resting against each other again, as if the storm outside had drawn us involuntarily together. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged in my throat. She looked up at me then, eyes searching, hesitant, as if she'd caught the edge of my thoughts. I caught a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze, the tiniest crack in the composure she usually wore like armor. My chest tightened. There was an invitation there, subtle but unmistakable, and I was torn between reaching for it and respecting the invisible boundary she hadn't crossed herself. Another buzz from her phone, another intrusion of the outside world, pulled her attention away. She straightened, a small sigh escaping her lips, and stepped back just enough to create the distance that had been temporarily erased. We didn't speak for a moment, only listening to the ring. I wanted to say something, anything, but all I could do was brush my fingers along the edge of the counter where hers had just been. It was nothing, but it was everything. And for a second, I almost thought she might lean in. Almost. We were sitting on opposite sides of the small hotel lounge, the hum of the air conditioner filling the empty space. She'd arrived early for her conference. I was here waiting to help her with some last-minute tech setup, but the moment stretched longer than either of us had intended. Neither of us spoke at first. I could feel the weight of her presence across the low coffee table, like gravity had shifted in the room, pulling me toward her without permission. She stirred her coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the ceramic cup, and finally looked up. Her eyes caught mine for a fraction longer than necessary, and I felt my stomach tighten. She didn't smile. She rarely did in these quiet moments, but there was a softness there that made the edges of her usual composure blur. "I don't know what this is," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I froze, my hands hovering over the charger I'd been untangling, trying not to let the tremor in my fingers show. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully, though the answer felt obvious in the tension between us. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she wrapped her hands around her cup, her knuckles pale, and stared at the liquid like it held the answers. "This, whatever this is between us, it doesn't feel like it should. And yet it's here. I can't pretend it's not." The words hit me harder than any storm outside could. I wanted to tell her it wasn't real, that I was imagining it, but every small gesture, every pause, every glance from her contradicted that lie. My throat felt tight. I couldn't speak without breaking something delicate in the air. "I've been trying to keep it normal," she admitted, and there was a jagged edge to her voice, a hint of frustration, maybe at herself, maybe at me. "And I can't anymore. Every time you're around, She stopped, biting her lip, her eyes flicking away. The silence that followed was heavier than anything she'd said. I didn't reach for her. I didn't want to break the fragile honesty of the moment with clumsy hands or words. Instead, I just watched, the way her hair fell over her face, the slow exhale that betrayed the effort it took to stay composed, the way her shoulders slumped a fraction as if carrying something I could only guess at. "What are we doing?" she finally asked again, more softly this time, almost to herself. But the question hung in the space between us, loaded, impossible to answer. I opened my mouth, closed it. Any answer would sound absurd, inadequate. I wanted to say something true, something that made her pain less sharp, but I couldn't. Instead, I let the quiet stretch, the silence speaking louder than any touch ever could. She sipped her coffee, then set the cup down with a deliberate calm that felt like surrender. Her gaze met mine one last time before she looked away, and in that fleeting second, I saw everything. The tension, the longing, the fear, and I knew the dynamic between us had changed irrevocably. She exhaled, almost like a confession, and whispered, "I don't know if I can keep pretending anymore." And just like that, the room felt smaller, heavier, charged with something neither of us could name, but both understood. I hadn't expected her to talk about it. Not here, not now, not with the low hum of the office behind us. She was perched on the edge of a worn leather chair, holding a small, faded photograph between her fingers. Her thumb traced the outline of a face I couldn't see from where I stood, but I could feel the weight of it, like a quiet gravity pulling the air in. "I didn't mean to bring it up," she said, voice breaking before she could finish. "I don't usually show this side of myself. Not to anyone." I nodded, unsure what to say, because whatever I said would sound shallow. I just waited, letting the silence support her, letting her choose the words. "It's him," she whispered, finally letting the photograph tilt toward me. A man's face, soft, familiar, someone I didn't know, but I could see why it mattered. Her lips pressed together, and she swallowed hard, blinking away something she didn't want me to see. We were supposed to have more time. I felt my chest tighten, not with pity, exactly, but with the impossible urge to reach across the space and steady her. I said nothing, though my hand itched to touch hers, to offer something solid in the middle of this fragile confession. You, you remind me of him, she said suddenly, eyes darting toward me, then away. Not in looks, in presence, the way you notice things, the way you wait, even when you don't have to. It's unsettling, but comforting too. Her words sank in, slow, deep, and unsettling. I didn't know if I should move closer or stay put. My throat felt tight, a hollow tug at my ribs. Every instinct in me screamed to speak, to say something that might break the tension, but nothing seemed adequate. She set the photo down on the desk, fingers lingering a fraction too long. The room was still, save for the hum of a distant copier. And for the first time, I saw her fully, not the careful, composed woman I'd admired from afar, but the one who had carried heartbreak quietly, who had learned to measure each step against the fear of losing more. I didn't think I'd ever feel it again, she admitted softly, almost to herself. That pull, that fragile hope. She glanced at me then, and it wasn't a look of flirtation, not exactly, but something more dangerous, something human and raw, something that could shift everything, if either of us let it. I swallowed and said nothing. I couldn't, not yet. The world outside the office buzzed on, oblivious to the tremor inside this small room. Finally, she exhaled, a shiver passing through her shoulders, and let her gaze rest on mine just a fraction too long. The kind of look that asks questions without words, that invites answers you might not be ready to give. And then she whispered, barely audible over the hum. I don't know if I'm ready to let that feeling go. It was quiet, fragile, but seismic, the kind of moment that rearranges everything, even if no one else notices. We were sitting on the park bench just as the evening light softened, the air carrying the faint scent of rain that had passed an hour ago. She'd been quiet the whole walk, letting me carry the weight of conversation, but there was a difference this time. A subtle relaxation in her shoulders, a softening in her gaze that made the space between us feel smaller. I never thought I'd admit it to anyone, she said finally, voice low, almost shy. Not like this. Not entirely. She didn't look at me, only at the slow ripple of the pond ahead, where a few ducks drifted lazily. I didn't need her to clarify. I already knew. Every glance, every pause, every tiny brush of fingers had been pointing here, to this quiet acknowledgement. I let the silence stretch, not out of discomfort, but because it felt like the only honest way to exist together in that moment. Her hand brushed mine as she shifted, accidental or deliberate. I couldn't tell, but I didn't pull away. My fingers rested lightly against hers, tracing the curve of her knuckles without pressure. That small contact spoke louder than any words we could have fumbled. I don't know what this means, she murmured after a pause. I know I don't want to undo it. Not this. I nodded slowly, understanding that this wasn't a grand declaration or a promise. It was presence. It was recognition. It was the slow, earned understanding that neither of us could go back to how things had been before, and that maybe we didn't want to. We didn't speak for a long stretch, only listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of cars. Her thumb brushed my hand lightly once, twice, and I realized I was holding my breath the entire time. Not with anticipation, exactly, but with the acute awareness of how fragile and precious this closeness was. I'm glad you're here, she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It didn't need to be. It was a simple truth, and the quiet weight of it made everything else unnecessary. I squeezed her hand once, a small reassurance, and she didn't move hers away. We sat like that for a long while, letting the moment fold into itself, letting the world continue around us without demanding more. There was no rush, no urgency, just the acknowledgement that the path we'd been walking toward each other was complete in its own subtle way. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the bench. She leaned slightly closer, forehead brushing mine for a heartbeat, enough to confirm what words could never fully capture. I felt the quiet inevitability of it, of us, without needing to define it, claim it, or explain it. And then she exhaled, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, and the moment was done. Not with fireworks or declarations, but with a stillness that felt heavier and truer than any sentence could ever be. We stayed there, together, hand in hand, letting the quiet fill the spaces that had once been unspoken. It was enough. I still remember that evening. Even now, months later, when the park was empty and the air smelled faintly of rain. Sitting on that bench, hand in hers, I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if we'd find a way to make it work, or if it was just a beautiful pause in time. But I knew one thing. Something inside me had shifted forever. I've always thought of myself as impatient, restless, the kind of person who rushes toward answers. But being with her, quietly, without pretense, taught me the opposite. That love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes, it seeps in through the small things, a shared glance, a pause that says everything, a hand brushing against yours in perfect timing. She's changed too. I see it in the way she allows herself to relax, even in fleeting moments. In the way she laughs without holding back, or lets her guard slip just enough for the world to catch a glimpse of her heart. She's still careful, still aware of the past, but she carries it differently now. Lighter, somehow, because it's shared with someone who sees her, really sees her. What we learned, I think, is that love doesn't have to be tidy. It doesn't need to be rushed, labeled, or perfected. It grows in the spaces between words, in the silence that stretches long enough to make a heartbeat loud, in the trust that accumulates over small, unremarkable moments. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. I've replayed those early interactions in my mind countless times. The stolen glances in the bookstore, the accidental brush of her fingers at the repair shop, the quiet evenings where words failed but presence didn't. Each moment felt insignificant on its own, but together, they built something real, something that neither of us could ignore. We didn't need grand confessions or dramatic gestures to mark it. We just existed alongside each other. And somehow, that quiet coexistence became the most profound declaration either of us had ever made. Looking back, I realized that the story isn't about what we said or didn't say. It's about what we felt and how patiently, stubbornly, we let ourselves feel it. That's what made the difference. That's what made it ours. I often catch myself smiling at random moments, remembering her subtle gestures, her small laughs, the way she tilts her head when she's thinking. And even now, when we're apart for days at a time, that memory hums in the background, steady and alive. Some things remain unspoken, but that's part of the beauty. Some connections don't need words. They just need attention, patience, and the willingness to exist in the same quiet space together. And I hope that, if you've been following this story, you can feel some of that too. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?